All right. So before we talk about inferences today, I just wanted to take a little bit of time to talk about registration for the spring semester. So registration looks like you're going to be able to see what day your priority is, and you're going to be able to see the spring schedule of classes on Monday, November 1st. So let me just show you where you'll be able to see that. So if you log into My Solano, the schedule is not up yet, but it will be soon. But then as soon as you log into My Solano, just over here underneath your student tab, right, you'll be able to, after the first, or on the first, excuse me, this little tab right here where it says when can I register? I'm just going to click this, and then it'll take you to this little page. And then after the first, you're going to be allowed to click. There'll be an option right there for spring 2022. And you'll click that and then click submit, and it'll give you the day that you're allowed to register for classes. And then in addition to that, the spring schedule will be live on November 1st. So you'll know what your registration priority is, and then you'll also be able to see the schedule to be able to know like what classes to sign up for, what's available and when. There's not a ton more at this point of classes that are going to be offered face-to-face on campus. This semester we were at 17%. In the spring, I think we're going to be at 20% of our course offerings, but there are some options for both English 2 and English 4 in the fall. In the spring that are going to be offered face-to-face. I'm teaching a section of English 2 on Monday and Wednesday from 9 till about 11. And then I know one of my colleagues is teaching a section of English 4 face-to-face. So that's an option. English 2 and English 4 are both classes that come, whether you take them online or face-to-face, are both classes that come after English 1. They both meet the same requirement, which is like the critical thinking advanced composition requirement. So, it's one of those classes that you would need to transfer for a specific degree, something like that. So you'll be able to see that like on the IGETSI readout. If anything, like the IGETSI readout is something that you have questions about, that you haven't met with a counselor and saw how to be able to like plan your future classes and things like that, let me know. I'm happy to meet with you during an office hour and kind of talk you through it. I don't know it as well as our counselors do, but I know a good bit about it, and I know how to talk to you about like selecting classes and stuff like that that makes sense for your general education. But the only difference between English 2 and English 4, sometimes just because of the course numbering, it sounds like you should take English 2 and then take English 4. When English 2 and English 4 are kind of parallel to each other, just imagine like after English 1, you get two options to go this direction or this direction. English 2 and English 4 are both critical thinking classes, and they both satisfy the same requirement. The difference between those classes is that English 2 is a critical thinking class that's based off of reading literature, and then English 4 is a critical thinking class that's based off of reading nonfiction. So in a class like English 2, for example, we would read short stories. You'd read in my specific class, we read like some plays, we read a graphic novel, we read a lot of short stories in that class, some poetry. Some instructors maybe will do more poetry, we'll do some novels, things like that. But really you're doing a lot of close reading and analytical writing based off of reading literature. English 4 is all nonfiction, so you're really looking, it's kind of a more intensive version of the type of work that you would do in an English 1 class, really looking at how writers build their arguments, what makes an effective argument, diving deep into like rhetorical strategies that writers use, looking at like the kind of the quality of one's argument in addition to the content, but how the argument is built. What are some holes they might have in the argument? We call those things like logical fallacies, which are mistakes that writers make in their argument. So really diving into that type of work in a class like English 4. Both of those are great options after taking English 1. I always recommend to students, kind of like while you're in English mode, you're doing a lot of writing. It's a good transition and kind of a good plan to go from English 1 and then take the next semester English 2 or English 4, if that works for your schedule. So there'll be options for those classes, plenty of versions of those classes to take online, right? Because the vast majority of our English classes for the spring are still going to be online. But if you're interested in taking some face-to-face classes, That's an option for English 2 and for English 4 also. The only thing to know is that Solano does have a vaccine mandate that's in place, or a testing mandate. So if you do decide for spring semester that you want to take face-to-face classes, then you'll have to either show proof of vaccination or proof of testing twice a week to be able to come onto campus. So if you have any questions about that specifically, I'm happy to answer those for you also. But it's really straightforward. You just, if you're vaccinated, you just upload a copy of your vaccination card to Canvas, and then you're cleared to be able to come on campus to take classes. Any questions about English 2 or English 4?
Are you teaching English 2 or 4?
I am. I'm teaching one section of English 2, but I'm teaching it on campus. So next semester, the majority of everything that I'm teaching is I'm going to be back. This semester, I'm only teaching 2 classes face-to-face. Next semester, I'm teaching 4 face-to-face. So the majority of the work that I'm doing next semester is on campus.
That sounds so wonderful. Okay, thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I know it's really nice to be back, and hopefully we'll start seeing more and more classes back on campus, and it's a really positive experience. It's a little different. There's not as many people on campus. There's some of the buildings, things still aren't open. The library's not open the way that it used to be, stuff like that. But we're definitely working to head in the right direction. Chris and I are both on campus. He works with me in 2 sections of English 1, and it's really nice to be back. So if that's something you're interested in, check your registration priority, because I think our face-to-face classes are going to fill up fairly quick. Just like I said, there's only one option for an English 2 face-to-face, but like I said, you just check your registration priority, and then you can sign up for that class pretty quick.
Yeah, and I'll say, when I was an undergrad, I took English 1 and English 2 with the same professor, and I found that super helpful because it just makes the transition really easy if you're going from one thing to the next to still be working with Jose, if that's what you want to do. But I mean, don't worry if you can't do that. Like, there's a lot of other great professors here. Like, you're gonna do fine. But yeah, English 2 or 4, both awesome opportunities depending on what you're kind of interested in and what you want to go into.
Yeah, we got some awesome people teaching those classes. So if there's if you're planning on taking the class online and you'd like a recommendation of instructor, just let me know, and I can look at the schedule when it goes live. I don't have the schedule out yet, so I don't know who's teaching them, but every semester, like a bunch of people that I work with, there's some really fantastic online teachers that do a really great job of teaching English 2 and English 4 online. So we can look at those. All right, so today we're going to be talking about inference. Next week, I'm going to focus more on rhetoric, just so I don't feel that I have to kind of smash both of those together. There's a little bit of reading in this week's module on rhetoric to kind of like help set the table a little bit for what we're going to talk about next week. But this week, we'll focus specifically on inference and assumption and drawing conclusion, because that's what we're going to be doing in the discussion. And that's really going to help us for diving forward and becoming more analytical and what we're working on in these next upcoming essays. So let me just share my screen really quick, and then we'll take a look at that. Oops. Okay, cool. So you should all be able to see this now. All right, so we're going to talk a little bit about inference and assumption, right? What it means to infer things in text, and what it means to make assumptions, right? A lot of these moves that we're talking about today are things that you already do, right? Things that you do in everyday life. I mean, most of the stuff that we cover in a class like this, when it comes to like building argument or presenting ideas, are things that are already familiar to us, right? Like, we're just now doing them in an academic context, or we're doing them in the context of an essay. But for the most part, like every day in our lives, in tons of different situations, we infer things, we make assumptions, we kind of, apply these critical thinking skills just to everyday things, right? Like, and I'll give some examples as we're looking through this morning. And this is one of those things I think is really important to think about, the moves that we already make and how those could be applied to an academic context, right? So let's think about what an assumption is. You may have heard people talk about like what the problem is with making assumptions. So basically, like whenever we have an assumption is just something that's accepted as true or certain, but we're drawing that acceptance on insufficient evidence, right? So maybe we could think of like situations where you can make an assumption about something, you can make a guess about something, but you're kind of coming to that conclusion a little bit too quick, right? Or you're coming to that conclusion without having enough evidence of something to be able to really help you come to a strong understanding of something or a strong conclusion about something. And that's really what it means to make an assumption, right? Accept something to be true or certain, but it happens without having enough evidence to be able to draw that conclusion. So assumptions typically work like this. This is what we call like deductive reasoning, right? And so here's an example of an assumption that was made about me pretty regularly, right? Like all through high school and after high school, like I was pretty big, right? And so like people would have this assumption about me and say, oh, well, like you're a big guy, do you play football? Or you're a big guy, you played football in high school, right? And so with this idea of deductive reasoning, which leads to a lot of assumptions, think about it as a mathematical formula, right? With this type of assumption, one is accepting that one thing must be true because another is, right? Kind of like assumes that all members of this group must share this similar characteristic. And so like when we think about assumption, think about like what DJ is talking about with single story. Think about this idea of, looking at situations and thinking about stereotype, right? That people could start to come to a conclusion based off of, because they see that one specific instance may be true, that as a result of that, everyone who shares this characteristic must also share another characteristic, right? So if I think about maybe aside from, sometimes it's like things that are relatively harmless, right? Like assuming that I played football because of my size when I was younger. Instead, maybe later on, there could be other situations where deductive reasoning or coming to assumptions can lead to things like stereotyping, can lead to things like profiling, right? Can lead to maybe serious consequences where we would assume something to be true about somebody just based on the fact that that might be true about one specific instance or one small group within a population, that there becomes kind of like this sweeping generalization that this must be true for everybody who shares that characteristic. Oops. So the problem with reasoning like this is that people can come to conclusions too fast, right? This is that idea of like what's called a hasty generalization, right? Where we generalize something too quick, right? We come to a conclusion entirely too fast. And so like, again, going back to this idea of thinking about Adichie's TED Talk, right? Like Adichie had conclusions about entire groups that she shared about her experiences. Similar people had those about her because of small different examples of what they saw. So for example, her conclusion about what she thought to be true about Mexico before she traveled there was based off of the things she saw in the news. Her conclusion that she shared about the way that what her roommate thought about her, was only based off of what little small things her roommate knew about people from an entire continent of Africa, right? And so this idea is like, because I've seen this and I have this idea in my head, and some people within this population could share these characteristics, well, because you have this identity, then that also must be true for you, right? And this is like one of those things that we recognize as a big problem with assumption. While we make assumptions all the time, right? And sometimes our assumptions can be correct, it's not really a reliable strategy, right? For critical thinking, for applying to an essay, things like that, because a lot of times we could be wrong. So here's an example of that. Think about looking at these pictures of these two sets of dogs, right? One dog on the left and then a couple of dogs on the right. Would you pet these dogs? For somebody in here, if I had the dog to the left was real and in front of you, would you pet that dog? Would anyone in here pet that dog, and why?
I would pet neither.
You would pet neither the dog
Yeah.
on the left nor the dogs on the right.
Yeah.
How come?
Okay.
I don't know. I just don't like dogs.
So you don't like any dogs.
Okay.
So based
I
off the
really
idea
not.
that you don't like dogs, none of those dogs would get pet. Okay.
Yeah.
So there's one piece of evidence, right? Or one factor that would influence your decision on whether or not you'd pet these dogs, either to the left or to the right. What do the people think?
Yeah.
Would somebody in here pet the
I would
dog?
definitely pet the dog on the left.
You'd pet the dog on the left. Good. Why, Chris?
Because I basically have had a dog like that.
Mhm.
That looked very similar, and she was the sweetest dog, just the nicest bulldog, just great.
Yeah. So maybe based off of that evidence, right? Based off of that experience that you have of having a dog that looked like the dog to the left, you would pet that dog, right? Are there people who would not pet the dog to the left, or would not pet the dogs to the right, but would pet the other dog?
Yeah, just off the images, I would not pet the dog on the left, and I would probably pet the dogs on the right. The dogs on the right are small. They remind me of puppies. I associate puppies with being harmless and friendly, and
Right.
the dog on the left looks like a full-grown pit bull, and that might not even be like a pit bull, but that's the first thing that comes to mind.
Right.
There's a stereotype that pit bulls are more violent than other dogs.
Right.
And then it would be more risk to just pet that dog.
Right.
Now, if
Good.
the dog was like wagging his tail and walked up to me, or like I knew the owner, or just from the way the dog behaved, like I'd probably still pet the dog, but not initially, and not just based off of the image.
That's right. Okay, good. So what you added there was if you had additional evidence, then you'd be
Yes.
able to draw a stronger conclusion. That's the difference between assumption and inference. Assumption would just be based off of just sightseeing, just based off of that idea. And you even used the word stereotype there, right? Just based off that idea of like the stereotype of what I know about pit bulls, I wouldn't pet the dog to the left. And I would pet the dogs to the right because they're smaller, they look like puppies. And based off of what I know about puppies, you know, maybe they're safer to pet. The dogs to the right are my dogs. They're not puppies, they're full grown, right? But they're just little, they have short little legs and tiny little dogs, right? And they're perfectly safe to pet. But also there could be the stereotype that smaller little dogs could be snippy, right? Could be mouthy and want to, you know, maybe people like, I've shared these pictures before, people like, oh, I've been bit by a small dog before. Whereas with a larger dog like this pit bull on the left, like Chris' experience, I've had a positive experience. If we're only going off the picture, and to Anthony's point, we come to this conclusion that we wouldn't pet them based off of what we believe to be true about all pit bulls, for example. That's an example of an assumption. If there's more evidence, if we start seeing other stronger pieces of evidence, if the dog's wagging its tail, if the owner says it's okay to pet the dog, if you know the dog comes up to you with like a really excited look on his face, if other people are petting the dog, whatever the case is, the more evidence that we have, the stronger conclusion that we can come to, right? And so that's really the difference between assumption and inference. So inference is based off of this idea of inductive reasoning. Inductive reasoning, there's not the same level of mathematical certainty. Our conclusions are based off of evidence and experiences, and inferences are based off of inductive reasoning. So here's what an inference is. An inference is a conclusion that you come to that's based off of the analysis of the evidence that you have in front of you. So your inference is only as strong as your evidence, right? And this is really important to think about, is that the difference between assumption and inference is assumption, you're coming to conclusion based off of just some preconceived notion, one thing that you see. When you're inferring something, you're looking at all the different examples of evidence and you're drawing conclusions based off of more than one piece of evidence, right? That you're really kind of looking at all the things that are laid in front of you and coming to a conclusion based off of that. So think about this is important to think about when it comes to inferring and how we use inference to build analysis, right? Is that this is really important to think about, because when we're reading through things, right, when we're doing critical reading in this class and other classes that we're applying the skills that we're gaining in English 1, 2, that we really have to think about, there's a lot of instances where writers won't tell us things directly, they'll show us things, right? They leave it up to us as critical thinkers to dive deep and to come to our own conclusions. Like, think about that maybe, for example, if you're watching a movie, right? Like, you could be watching a movie and you kind of start to figure out maybe who the bad guy is in the movie as you're watching it. The person doesn't come in and introduce themselves as like, I'm the bad guy, right? Like, instead, you start watching it, you start developing ideas, you start looking at evidence, you start coming to conclusions based off of that evidence. Same thing maybe when you get to know somebody. You get to know somebody, right? I don't know, make a new friend, meet a new neighbor, I don't know, go on a first date, whatever the case is, like that person that you get to know, you start to come to conclusions about them over time. It's not like somebody introduces themselves to you and gives you all their characteristics and lets you know what kind of person they are. But instead, over time, you start to learn who somebody is by their actions, right? By the things they do, by how they treat other people, right? By all of these different things you're able to use as evidence. And then you come to your conclusion about that person. This is the type of person that I want to be friends with. This is the type of person that I want to hire for a job. This is the type of person I want to be in a relationship with. Whatever the case is, you just start to use all of those different pieces of evidence to come to that conclusion about that person. So drawing inferences, you do all the time, right? And what's really important to think about is that this idea of schema, and schema is you, schema is your life experiences, right? Is important to be able to help you understand evidence that you look at, right? And evidence is whatever content you're reading. Evidence can be books, evidence can be pictures, evidence can be body language, evidence can be situations that you're in, right? So for example, Chris's schema is different than my schema, right? The life experiences he's had, the, things that he's lived through, the maybe classes he's taken, the things that he's read, all those different kind of things. While we may have some similarities, we also have a lot of differences. And our differences make it where we draw different conclusions. For example, I've never owned a dog like the one in the previous picture. So I've never had a pit bull before. And so as a result of that, my schema is different, and my answer to the question of whether or not I pet that dog could be different from Chris's based off of that evidence, right? It's really important to think about that who you are and what life experiences you have matter into what kind of conclusions you're able to come to, right? So like, for example, maybe being able to see a specific logo, right? Like a lot of times, like when I'm in a classroom, right, and I can see people around the room, one of the examples that I'll give is if somebody is wearing, a black hat with an orange SF logo on it, I can infer that they're Giants fans because I know what that logo is and I know what it means. One of the examples that I give in my class is that, like, my grandmother, for example, who's 97 years old and has lived in Mexico for almost all of her life, doesn't know what that orange SF means. And I don't think my grandma even knows what baseball is, right? So my grandma would not be able to come to the same conclusion about what fans somebody or what team somebody is a fan of solely based off of the hat that they're wearing. The evidence is the same, but the schema is different. The life experience is different. So she's not able to come to that conclusion, right? So I think that's really important to think about, is that like the way that we can interpret the evidence really depends on what life experiences somebody has, what kind of things somebody is interested in, right? What type of maybe hobbies you have, what classes you've taken, what things you've read, all those kind of things become important, right? So like, for example, I was wearing this t-shirt out the other day, and like I was like in a grocery store or something like that, and somebody asked me like, oh, who's your favorite Peloton instructor? And struck up a conversation with me about like what rides I like doing on my Peloton bike and which teacher I like using the most. If that person didn't know what a Peloton bike was, they wouldn't have been able to come to the conclusion that I ride a Peloton or I have a favorite instructor. But because that person had the schema for this brand and knew what this shirt was, they were able to ask me that question, right? So we kind of think about maybe situations where you're able to come to a specific conclusion based off of evidence that you know. If I'm at Target, somebody, and I'm wearing a red shirt, somebody can infer that I work there. But that's because they have the schema to know that people who work at Target wear red, right? So it's like, it's really important to think about the evidence that you have in front of you is only kind of a piece of the puzzle. You also have to be able to interpret the evidence. And depending on our life experiences, some can interpret evidence different than others. And this is really important for the reading process because your life experiences matter as you're reading through something, right? So here's an example of how we could draw inference. What can you tell me about these people based off of this picture? What are some inferences that you can come to about them? Who has some ideas? This is taken from a graphic novel. It's a wordless graphic novel called The Arrival. There's no words throughout this entire book other than the title and the name of the writer, which is Sean Tan. But what can you tell me about these people based off of the evidence that you have in front of you?
It looks like late 19th, early 20th century.
Okay, so we can kind of maybe get a guess about like what time they're living in, right? What evidence do you have to support that?
I feel like the clothing
Mhm.
and
Hey.
the lack of technology in the
Yeah.
picture.
Yeah, like if it was my breakfast table, there'd be like a couple cell phones on the table, right? You see an iPhone laying there, something like that. Sure. Maybe lack of technology, all that kind of stuff. Good. What else can we infer about them?
I would also say that like I would also say that like the style of the picture also gives that idea
Ooh,
of like
yeah.
it's black and white, it's grainy and all that.
Yeah, kind of like that sepia tone look almost, right?
Mhm.
Yeah, that's a good point. What else can we infer about them based off of the evidence that we see in front of us?
I initially wanted to say poor, but he seems to like the vest or whatever it doesn't seem that poor, maybe working class, and that just her clothing is just what comfortable like housewife wear was at the time. So they don't
Okay.
necessarily have to be poor, but definitely not rich.
But okay, so then show me some evidence that you would use to we'll use that as our inference that we're coming to. We're going to try to infer and not assume that this family is definitely not rich, but maybe, you know, working class or living in poverty. What evidence could you use to come to that conclusion?
Well, her gown still seems like I feel like it like I think of a potato sack when I see it.
Okay.
The table's worn,
Right.
and with the era that I've already mentioned, like his shirt vest combo, the hat up on the wall, like that seems to me like working class uniform.
Mhm.
That if he had more money, there'd be a little bit more pomp to it.
Yeah.
You know, like so yeah, I think their clothing is how I infer their like wealth.
Yeah, the clothing, the table, maybe you could even like
Yeah.
the teapot has a crack in it, right?
Yeah.
Like you could also use that. So the point would be if we would only use one piece, if I were to say, oh, you know what, based off the way that they're dressed, and that's it, that would be more of an assumption. But as we start stacking more and more pieces of evidence, and in this case, maybe looking at the table, looking at the stuff that's in the background, it's not super fancy, not very ornate, the cracked teapot. The more and more evidence that I give, the stronger my inference becomes, right? I could still be wrong, right? I mean, it could be one of those, and maybe we know people like that, right? Where you see somebody who lives like a very like you know, kind of like basic or like humble lifestyle, but in reality, financially is doing very well, right? Or it could be the other way around. Maybe somebody could be very, very ornate, and you could have all of the evidence to suggest that person is wealthy, but in reality, maybe they could be in a significant amount of debt. So when it comes to inference, we still don't know for sure. You could be wrong with an inference, right? You could see every single sign that you should pet one of those dogs and be like, and then get your finger bit, right? But different than assumption, you only have like one piece of evidence that you're kind of using as like, well, everyone, you know, who looks this certain way or has this certain characteristic is part of this group. This, you're like, I'm using a bunch of different pieces of evidence and I'm trying to come to a conclusion on it based off of what I'm seeing. Again, you could be wrong, but the more evidence you have, the stronger inference you're making. Because it's important to think that like you're sometimes not going to be told things by writers, just like you're sometimes not going to be told things directly by people, right? Maybe you could read a situation wrong. We've all had that happen, I'm sure, right? Where you're like, oh, I thought I could trust this person. And I'm like, yeah, I thought you could too. You had every single reason to, and maybe it turned out that wasn't a correct inference, right? So a lot of times like inferences aren't going to be, they're not going to be exact. They're not going to be certain. They're not going to be fact or written directly in a book like they would maybe a textbook for a history class or something like that. A lot of times like we come to conclusions and we hope that we have enough evidence to come to a sound conclusion, but it may not be 100% correct. So think about, here's how we draw conclusions in text, right? So if we look back at Noah's book from an earlier chapter, Noah said, when I look back, I realized that she raised me like a white kid, when he's talking about the way that his mom parented him. Not white culturally, but in the sense of believing that the world was my oyster, right? So he brings up this idea that his mom raised him with a sense of entitlement, right? Like in this way that like she raised him like he says, like a white kid, not culturally white, but in an entitled way. What evidence would we have from the book to be able to support Noah's claim? What evidence could we think of that would support this idea to be able to draw this conclusion that his mom raised him like the world was his oyster?
There's the part where she like they drive around neighborhoods and look at big houses and try to like, and guess like how many rooms are in it. And
right.
So it puts the idea of a home like that in his head. And then, and that maybe he could obtain something like that. She at least like it. It didn't really say that she said that you could have a house like this, but she showed it to him and she didn't say that you couldn't.
Right.
Yeah. And she takes him ice skating and she takes him to the movies, like all these places and activities that people in his neighborhood wouldn't go to normally.
Right. And so like sitting up front at white church.
Exactly. So there's all these things throughout the book, right? Like, keeping him constantly around books, right? Like trying to give him the best quality education that she can, right? All these different things to like build this entitlement, that we can find evidence throughout the book that would suggest that the reason that Noah was able to find success and confidence and identity within the context of extreme segregation he was in was because of the way his mom parented him. We could be wrong about that, but I think that's a pretty strong conclusion, the more evidence that we find to be able to help us come to that, right? And so that's really that idea of like how inference becomes important when we're reading, is that we're looking at evidence and we're drawing conclusion based off of that evidence. So think about, what argument could you make about the impact that his mom's parenting had on his future, right? And what evidence could we find to support this claim? So if we think about like creating that argument, right, then we could create the argument that like Noah's mom was able to help him build a sense of entitlement, and he was able to use that entitlement, right, or that feeling of confidence or that understanding of like maybe he has a place in this world to find success. And then going back to your point, Anthony, like we can look at, well, she showed him that world, she showed him those houses, and she didn't directly say, hey, you could live in this house one day. But by showing him that, she showed him what was possible, right? So we can think about how using evidence, right, that we see throughout a text, in the same way that we used evidence in that picture, and the same way that we maybe would use evidence when we're looking at, dogs walking down the street, we can come to conclusions based off of that evidence that we see in front of us, right? That's this big idea of when we're reading closely, that we're looking for specific pieces of evidence and how we interpret that evidence to be able to come to strong conclusions, right? And so that's what we're going to be focusing on this week is really kind of being able to dive in and trying to make some sort of strong conclusion based off of the evidence that we have in front of us. So this week in our discussion post, let me share my screen really quick. That's what we're going to be doing, right? So like an inference is this idea, again, that we're coming to a conclusion based off of the evidence that we have in front of us, right? And so the directions for what we're doing this week in our discussion is looking at the relationships that he has with people in his family and how those relationships vary significantly, right? The impact that his mom has on his life is very different than how his mother, husband Abel affects Noah when he's growing up, right? So he gives us different examples of the experience that he has with different family members, everything from, his little brother to Abel, to his mom, to his grandmother, right? To all sorts of different people around him. And so what we want to think about is how is he affected by those relationships? And there are places where he gives us some direct ideas, some of his direct thoughts on how they affect him. But there's other places, like for example, the chapter with the mulberry tree, and when he sees Abel act violent for the first time, right? Like how he is affected by the things that he sees around him, the way that his life is impacted. So what you want to do is think about, pick a specific family member that Noah writes about, and then think about what would you believe the impact is this family member has on his life? What different pieces of evidence could you use? And you want to find at least two different examples, right? Because just one example would be just an assumption, right? That we're assuming something to be true based off of this one piece of evidence. But the more evidence that we find, the stronger our inference is. So try to infer, how do I think that Noah is affected by the relationship that he has with this person based off of the evidence that you find about the nature of his relationship with that specific family member that he writes about. Any questions at all on what we're doing this week and how we use inference to dive deeper into some of the points that he's making? Okay, cool. So I will be in my office hour for, till 1 o'clock today. So if there's any other questions as people are working, you can stop in and ask. Or if there's any questions you have throughout the week, just please don't hesitate to send me an email, send Chris an email. And then we can give you some feedback or answer any questions as you're working along. Remember, the first next Monday, and I'll try to remember to give a reminder also, like registration priority information will open up. You'll be able to see the spring schedule. I'm stuck in fall mode in my head right now. You'll be able to see the spring schedule and see when you can sign up for classes, what classes are available. But as you also this week, if you have any questions about registration, what classes you should be taking next or anything like that, you can also let us know and we can help give some feedback on that. I was like, both of us were students at Solano. A lot of the people that we took for classes are still teaching at Solano. So it's kind of a nice opportunity to talk to somebody who's taken a lot of these classes, can give you some feedback on like what classes I took, like, for example, like when it comes to general ed, right? Like there's some classes that you have to take, some choices that you have. And there were some classes, like, for example, I had to take a physical science class and like, I took geology and like really, really enjoyed it. And it was just something I needed for general ed and didn't think I would enjoy it as much as I did. So it's like, sometimes, it's just like talking to somebody about what classes you might be taking, as two people who went to Solano and took some of those classes, might be able to give you some feedback or some different experiences that we had.
Like Jose said, I wouldn't say that, like I would know as much as your counselor would know about like the proper classes to take or anything, but I'm more than happy to talk with people about like the experiences I had and teachers I had, and I can help look through classes that you need and so forth and think through options with you. I'm more than happy to do that. Yeah.
And that was one of the things that was was helpful for me once I got later on, is that like when I started college, like I was a first generation college student and I didn't really have any friends that had done it before or anyone in my family that had done it before. So it was all new to me, right? So like just knowing like what classes to take, what the difference were with some of these classes, like getting recommendations of cool classes from people, like that was something that I felt like I was missing. So if there's like ever any of those conversations that anyone wants to have, like let us know, and we're happy to kind of share some of our experiences and talk you through some options of what's available. And then obviously in addition to that, if you have the opportunity to make a an appointment with a counselor to find out like kind of directly what you'll need. That's also a really good option. Okay, cool. So again, let me know if you have any questions this week as you're working. I'll be available in my office hours, and then yeah, reach out and let us know anything as any questions you have, whether it's regarding what we're working on this week or anything related to registration for the upcoming weeks.
Take care.